In a world replete with private revelations, malicious rumors, scientific sensationalism, and independent journalism, we as viewers and consumers are confronted daily with competing accounts of events deemed crucial to our personal well-being. These accounts, constituted by a series of supposed facts, subsequently shape our worldview and leanings. They inform what we want, why we want it, and how we believe that we can get it. In other words, facts matter, and how we distinguish facts matters. In this video, we will be exploring the controversy between 17th century experimentalist Robert Boyle and political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. We will first introduce the nature of the problem emerging from physical experiments of the age. Then we will discuss how the series of ensuing arguments ultimately divided the world into one of facts and one of philosophy. I'm Edward Lichty, and you're watching Impulsive Abstraction. The controversy concerned universal assent among experimentalists with regards to the operation of a device known as an air pump, at the time the pride of the Royal Society. Essentially, through a series of valves and a piston, the air pump evacuated a glass vessel of its contents, and within this vessel, further experiments could be conducted. What was of prime interest to Hobbes, Boyle, and their contemporaries was the contents of this vessel following many exsuctions. Prior to the air pump, it had been demonstrated that when a tube filled with mercury was inserted into a pan of the substance, the mercury in the tube freely suspended above that in the pan by approximately 29 inches. What concerned experimentalists and philosophers alike was the space at the top of the tube, known as the Torricellian space. Under intense scrutiny was whether or not, upon the displacement of the mercury from the tube to the pan, this cavity contained any substance at all. The answer to this question would conceivably resolve age-old disputes between the vacuists and the plenists. The vacuists held that an absolute vacuum, that is, a space devoid of all substance, could exist in nature, while the plenists insisted that a plenum, a subtle fluid that suffused all of space, must remain by definition a body and being. There are many theories as to how the mercury remained suspended. Some posited that it was the limit of expansion of the leftover air, others that the weight of the atmosphere counteracted the weight of the mercury, but nevertheless the Torricellian space was suffused by a plenum, and still others that it represented the limits of expansion of the absolute vacuum. The void and void experiment offered a means of comparing these theories. Boyle situated the Torricellian apparatus within the air pump receiver and exsucked its contents such that both the interior and exterior surfaces of mercury were subjected to void, hence void and void. He observed the descent of the column of mercury, which he attributed to the removal of the spring and weight of the air acting on the fluid surfaces as pressure. He defined the operational vacuum as the absence of pressure induced by the removal of air, but he refused to comment on the philosophical problem of the absolute vacuum in plenum. In fact, he concluded that the conflict could not be resolved by experimental means. Why? In order to understand this, we need to understand what is permissible in the experimental worldview. Robert Boyle sought to establish a natural philosophy grounded in the production and circulation of matters of fact. Matter of fact was an observed occurrence whose causes lacked human agency. Something that involved human artifice could be made and unmade. It could be good or bad depending on how well it fulfilled its intended purpose. But the matter of fact couldn't be made or unmade, good or bad. It simply occurred as a function of natural processes, the mind witnessing and reflecting nature. By this witnessing, a fact was also subject to probability and fallibility, as it relied on our empirical or sensory experience and the faithful recollection and transmission of observers. It was to generate appropriate certainty and legitimate assent by virtue of agreement about the observation. In other words, the matter of fact was the result of the aggregation of beliefs of witnesses, and the multiplication of witnesses, much like those attesting to the commission of a crime, increased the probability that the event actually occurred. Aggregation of beliefs rendered knowledge production a social enterprise, and Boyle organized his community to support the basis of knowledge in the matter of fact. He championed testimony and physical demonstration. Replication or repeatability of an experiment rendered it in principle capable of securing the assent of an infinite number of observers. This is why the Royal Society and scientific bodies today promoted the demonstration of experiments in a public setting with expert witnesses of good repute. But in order to generate universal assent, it became necessary to establish a literary component to communicate to those who, by virtue of their status or by virtue of the integrity of the experiment, could not be present. Virtual witnessing. The most important aspect of scientific reporting was not the exhaustive defense of a theory, but the preparation of reliable testimony. That is, if not everyone possessed access to the materials to reproduce the experiment, he must rely on the written and photographic depictions of the report to formulate in his mind its progress. Furthermore, as he ultimately received a version of the experiment that was less dense than in-person witnessing, he must be assured through the style of writing, modest, exceedingly detailed, and unremorseful to failure, that it occurred as written. In other words, the experimental communique was the place to garner credibility as a witness, not the place to decide the question of the vacuum. Perhaps more divisive was that the matter-of-fact, experimentalist reasoned, must be categorically separated from the cause. In the terms of Boyle's time, God did not elect to reveal unto man the contents of the clockwork of the world, only its exterior. The mechanisms inside could involve an infinite array of causal relationships impossible to access with mere observations of its face. Hence, theories or hypotheses were to be treated as conjectural rather than factual, and indeed, no matter the evidence, these models could never achieve the title of fact. Hence, the causes of the descent of the Mercury in the Torricellian space were at best accurate guesses, though the number of guesses could be cold in understanding that the causes invoked must produce the matter of fact observed. On all other matters, the experimentalist was to observe nescience, or claims to ignorance, including matters of vacuum or plenum. All of this seems pretty robust, so what was Hobbes' problem? Well, this giant of philosophy was concerned about assent and social order. He was well aware of the probabilistic and fallibilistic nature of the matter of fact, and he attacked the basis of knowledge in such unclear or uncertain observations. For Hobbes, one could only generate universal assent if one appealed to the reason, a faculty which, unlike elaborate instruments, everyone actually possessed, and proceeded from axiomatic statements and agreed-upon principles to the phenomenon in question. In other words, he distinguished the synthetical from the analytical modes of knowledge production, and he only granted the former the status of philosophy. But more than that, he claimed that the only things that humans could ever understand were things of their own design. For Boyle, the mind was to reflect nature, but for Hobbes, it was to create it. Geometry was his emblematic example. While most, if not all, shapes in nature are not perfect geometric forms, the construct of geometry, based on certain key principles and assumptions about shapes, bodies, and extension in space, permitted the discovery of a vast array of necessary causal relationships, which, when approximated in nature, illustrated conclusions from concrete methodologies. Geometry did not rely upon the consensus of experimenters to prove that the event must have occurred, but proceeded from consensus at the most foundational level to consensus about the proved event. Nowhere did individual belief or fallibilistic experience impinge upon the methodology. Let us take this further. Not only did Hobbes doubt the production of universally accepted knowledge from experimental methods and the aggregation of personal beliefs, but he also argued that nescience with regard to the causes of things rendered Boyle's program truly vacuous. If no explanation were accepted, then our mechanistic understandings were not improved. He went so far as to compare designers of intricate experimental apparatuses to artisans who, like their craftsman counterparts, found machines useful for inducing the desired effect without knowledge of how that effect was imparted. In short, if philosophy is a science of causes that demands systematic formulations of principled causal chains, then experimentalism was not natural philosophy, but natural history. It had its place in illustrating effects, but could not serve as the basis of assent. Needless to say, Hobbes did not appreciate what he termed a misappropriation of philosophical language, the cornerstone of proofs. Boyle had redefined the term vacuum to refer to the operational vacuum rather than the absolute vacuum. Hobbes first supplied a proof as to why the notion of the absolute vacuum was absurd based on definitions of body. He then demonstrated that by supplying explanations for the weight and spring of his air, Boyle could not avoid justifying the causes of this weight and spring for sake of intellectual consistency. To remedy this and avoid absurd conclusions, Hobbes offered that air was actually a heterogeneous mixture of earthy corpuscles, basically little hard spheres, and subtler aether, like a fluid that filled all of space. While the air pump could evacuate the corpuscles, the aether, by its infinite fineness and fluidity, would intrude the apparatus via any deformation or imperfection in the interfacing components, especially the piston and cylinder wall. By this reasoning about bodies, all of the phenomena could be explained without recourse to absurd notions such as self-propulsion or the existence of the incorporeal body of the vacuum. Ultimately, what Hobbes was pushing was that 1. An abuse of language resulted in absurd causes, 2. One cannot support one cause without justifying all causes equally, and 3. Total assent cannot be achieved by basing causes on matters of fact. How did Boyle respond to these criticisms? Well, he did what any good experimentalist would do and improved his pump. He submerged it in water, a fluid which supposedly sealed better against any intrusion of the ether, modified the receiver such that bellows could be attached to it to extract whatever substance remained following evacuation, and employed the gauge of a feather in order to test the sensibility of this extract. He found that the feather did not flutter when he forced out the contents of the bellow, concluding that while the aether could exist in a form that could conceivably permeate the water and even the glass of the receiver, it was at present insensible to experiment, and hence a metaphysical or beyond physical entity that could not be factually determined. He therefore separated the plenum vacuum debate from the experimental program and the production of genuine knowledge. We have established that the matter of fact serves as the basis of experimental knowledge, using an analytical framework to backtrack from agreed-upon effects to hypotheses about their causes. We have seen how assent regarding matters of fact is attained via testimony and shared witnessing, the aggregation of individual beliefs increasing the probability of occurrence. Finally, we have discussed how virtual witnessing relies upon objective communication of experimental developments and results, with causes separated as conjectural constructs or malleable models. On the other hand, we have exposed the underbelly of the experimental program. We have challenged the senses and unclear language as reliable indicators of real things, positing that the mind cannot reflect on nature but only grasp at mental constructs. We have identified that causes cannot be factual, but also cannot be specially justifiable, each step in our reasoning deserving careful scrutiny according to established principles. Finally, we have distinguished the physical from the metaphysical by virtue of sensibility, recognizing that insensible entities cannot be evaluated on experimental grounds and thereby lack a factual designation. This framework is exceptionally robust and widely applicable. As with any framework, however, there are caveats. What are we to say of those private moments of personal growth and fulfillment? What of those bizarre sightings of seemingly otherworldly phenomena that go down in legend? What of our experience of potentially metaphysical entities such as the mind or the soul? What of collective adherence to observations or chains of reasoning which are grossly incorrect? Are these not real? Do we have to prove or repeat them in order to attain assent from others? These questions display the inherent vulnerabilities of the experimental program, that in capturing everything as a matter of fact, everything must be empirically observed and repeatable. This process does not dismiss anomalies or once-off experiences as unreal, nor does it assume that unobserved things are unreal. The fact is simply the socially accepted form of knowledge, and it is perhaps the best that we can muster. It demands a process by which we can be assured because we deserve to be assured. But, as Hobbes would undoubtedly say, if we wish to agree, sometimes we just need a model that is good enough. That's all for now, and I'll see you next time, further down the impulse.